The snow had a way of swallowing sound in the Montana backcountry, muting the world until even a man's heartbeat felt too loud. Ethan Walker trudged through drifts that reached his knees, each step a battle against the cold and his own exhaustion. The Bitterroot Mountains rose around him like white cathedral walls, sharp and merciless, cutting into a sky the color of steel. It was January, the dead heart of winter, and for most men, this forest was a place to avoid. For Ethan, it was the only place where silence felt safer than memory. 3 years had passed since Afghanistan, yet the desert still lived in him. He carried the weight of a dozen faces he couldn't save, the shriek of mortars that still ripped through his sleep, the heavy silence of men who never came home. Doctors in Missoula had given him pills and pamphlets. Manageable, they'd called it, as if nightmares were weeds you could trim. He had flushed the pills 6 months ago, tired of feeling like a ghost drifting through his own skin. Since then, isolation had been his medicine. The cabin his father built decades earlier, 3 miles off a logging road, buried deep in the Bitterroots, became his bunker. The wilderness was unforgiving, but at least it asked nothing of him. Today, though, something had disturbed that fragile balance. He had risen before dawn, restless from another night of fractured sleep, and noticed tracks in the snow behind the cabin. At first, he thought they belonged to elk, big, wide prints, deeper than a deer's. But as he followed them into the timber, his pulse had quickened. These weren't elk. The spacing, the weight, too massive. He had never seen anything like it. Curiosity, one of the few emotions that still had teeth in him, pulled him farther than he intended, deeper into the trees where the cold gnawed harder at his bones. By late afternoon, the light slanted low through the pines, casting the snow in long shadows. That was when he saw it. A vast shape collapsed beside a frozen stream. His breath caught, frosting in the air. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a drift of snow, a fallen log. Then it moved, a shudder, a labored exhale. "My God," Ethan whispered, crouching instinctively. It was a horse. No, something larger than any horse he'd known. White from mane to hoof, the animal must have stood over 18 hands when upright. Now it lay on its side, ribs heaving, flanks dark with blood. The snow beneath it was stained crimson, a brutal contrast against the pale world. Ethan's training, long dormant but never gone, kicked in. He scanned for predators. Mountain lion, wolves, no sign. He edged closer, hand brushing the hunting knife at his belt. The horse's eyes flicked open, dark and startlingly intelligent, locking on him with a wary exhaustion. "Easy," Ethan murmured, voice rough from disuse. He had spoken fewer words in the last 6 months than most people did in a day. But the tone, steady and calm, was one he remembered using with young soldiers on their first patrols. The animal tried to rise as he drew closer, legs thrashing weakly, but collapsed with a grunt. Ethan froze, torn between instinct and reason. The wound was ugly, a deep gash along the left flank, likely from a fight with another stallion or the claws of a mountain lion. Infection had already set in. The horse was emaciated, ribs cutting sharp lines beneath its hide. Its nostrils flared as it fought for air. "Mercy," a voice inside him said. "End it quickly." He drew the knife, steel glinting in the fading light. One strike, and the suffering would stop. That was what he had done overseas, sometimes with men he cared about more than life itself. End the pain before it grew unbearable. He knelt, blade steady, the horse's eye fixed on him. And something stopped him. It wasn't fear or pity, but recognition. In those dark depths, he saw pride and unyielding will to live that mirrored something still fractured inside him. It was the look of a soldier refusing to lay down, even when the body was broken. "You're not giving up, are you?" Ethan muttered. His throat tightened. Too damn stubborn to die. The horse snorted weakly, as if in answer. Ethan exhaled, his hand trembling. Then he slid the knife back into its sheath. "That makes 2 of us." The cold bit deeper, but he shrugged out of his canvas jacket and draped it across the horse's shoulders. The animal flinched at his touch, but did not resist. Ethan tore strips from his shirt, pressing a field bandage against the wound. The horse's muscles quivered but held. "This is going to hurt," Ethan said softly, though he knew the words were more for him than for the beast. It had been months since he'd spoken to another living soul. When the bandage was tied off, Ethan scouted quickly. Shelter was impossible to build properly before nightfall, but he stacked pine boughs against a fallen tree, fashioning a crude windbreak. He emptied his water bottle into his hat and set it near the horse's mouth. The animal drank greedily, confirming dehydration. "That's it," Ethan coaxed. "Fight." The light was draining fast, shadows thickening. His cabin lay 3 miles back through snow that would crust solid as the temperature dropped. The horse would not survive the night alone, but neither could Ethan drag a 1,000-pound animal through the forest in darkness. "I'll be back," he promised, crouching close enough to feel the weak gust of breath against his skin. "First light, just hold on." Reluctantly, he turned away. The horse's eyes followed him until the trees swallowed the clearing. That night, the storm rose. Wind clawed at the cabin walls, rattling the shutters like fists. Ethan paced the floor, boots heavy against the boards. For years, his nights had been filled with echoes of war explosions, screams, the sickening thud of artillery. But tonight, the battlefield inside him was quiet. Instead, his mind circled back to the horse, its heaving chest, the will in its eyes. What was he doing? He had come here to cut himself off from the world, to live out his days in silence. He wasn't supposed to care. Yet the image of that white body staining the snow would not leave him. He sat at the window, staring into the storm. Trees bent and cracked under the weight of wind. The cabin felt smaller than ever, suffocating with its silence. He pressed a hand against the glass, imagining the horse out there, fighting for every breath against cold and darkness. The night stretched long. Sleep came only in broken snatches, and when it did, it wasn't mortars or screams that woke him, but visions of the horse collapsing into stillness. When the first gray light of dawn filtered over the ridge, Ethan was already packing. Rope, blankets, medical supplies, a makeshift travois strapped to his old pickup. He moved with urgency, driven by something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. As he shouldered his pack and stepped out into the cutting wind, a thought struck him sharp as the cold. What if, when he reached that clearing again, the snow was empty? What if all he found were hoofprints leading nowhere, and a stain in the white that no storm could erase? He tightened his grip on the rope, heart hammering with a fear he couldn't quite name. And then, he started back into the forest. Ethan pushes deeper into the snow, every step louder in his ears. The tracks are still there, half buried by the night's storm. He follows them with a rising dread until the trees open to the clearing. Ahead, something vast and white shifts faintly in the drifts. The horse is still alive, but barely. Its eyes find him once again, and for the first time in years, Ethan hears a voice inside that isn't haunted by war. It's a question he can't ignore. If I save you, can you save me? The forest was silent except for Ethan's breath, ragged and harsh in the cold air. Snow groaned beneath his boots as he followed the half-buried trail back toward the clearing. Every step felt heavier than the pack strapped to his shoulders. Rope coiled at his hip. Medical supplies rattled in a tin box. A blanket dangled from his arm, stiff with frost. The storm had swallowed the night, but dawn now struggled over the ridges, thin and gray. Light seeped between the trees, turning every branch into a blade. Ethan pushed on, fighting the old instinct to turn back, to retreat to the safe prison of his cabin. He had spent years doing exactly that, retreating. But not today. The clearing opened suddenly. Snow lay heavy, undisturbed, except for the massive shape crumpled against the frozen stream. For one terrible moment, Ethan thought he was too late. The horse was still, a mountain of white against the white. No movement, no breath. Then an ear twitched. A slow exhale steamed faintly into the morning. Relief struck so hard it made him sway. "You held on," Ethan whispered, kneeling beside the animal. "Damn stubborn thing." The horse's eyes cracked open, cloudy with exhaustion, but still fixed on him. That same look, unyielding, proud, unwilling to surrender. Ethan set down his gear. He worked quickly, cleaning the bandage he had wrapped last night. Blood had seeped through, freezing into dark crusts against the hide. He peeled the cloth away, wincing at the smell of infection. The wound was angry, swollen. Without real antibiotics, it would fester. He pulled out antiseptic and poured it slowly, murmuring nonsense to steady both himself and the horse. The animal flinched, but didn't lash out. "Easy, easy, ghost," Ethan said, though the name had not yet been given. It came to him unbidden, natural as breath. A ghost out of snow, out of nowhere. When the wound was dressed, Ethan sat back on his heels. His breath puffed white as he looked at the horse's massive frame. Getting it back to the cabin, that was the impossible part. 3 miles through broken terrain, 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone, alone. Logic told him it couldn't be done. He should end it here, let the beast die with dignity, rather than prolong suffering. But logic had no voice in him today, only the memory of those eyes. "Not leaving you here," Ethan muttered. He pulled the rope from his pack, began fashioning a travois, 2 poles lashed with cross straps, meant to drag weight across snow. It was crude, but it was all he had. The horse stirred weakly when Ethan looped the rope around its torso. Muscles quivered beneath skin, ribs showing with each strained breath. "You've got to help me," Ethan said, voice rising with urgency. "I can't carry you." He tugged gently, coaxing. The horse heaved, tried to rise, and collapsed with a grunt that rattled the ground. Snow sprayed across Ethan's face. "Again," he urged. Again, the animal struggled, legs flailing weakly. Ethan pressed his shoulder under the massive neck, grunting, straining with all the strength left in him. The smell of sweat and blood filled his nose. His legs trembled. The horse fell again. Ethan dropped to his knees in the snow, chest heaving, despair pressing down like another weight. "This is insane," he muttered, clutching fistfuls of snow. I can't. The horse shifted, groaned. Its eye rolled toward him. That same look, "Don't quit." Ethan's throat closed. Afghanistan came rushing back. The dust, the roar of gunfire. A young soldier screaming for help as Ethan tried to drag him out of a kill zone. He hadn't been strong enough then. 3 men lost that night. 3 men he carried like stones in his chest. Not again. "On 3, Ethan growled, as much to himself as to the horse. 1, 2, 3. He heaved. The horse strained, muscles bunched, hooves scrabbled against the ice. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought it was hopeless. Then the beast surged up, legs folding, trembling, but somehow locking. The horse swayed, towering unsteadily, leaning against Ethan's shoulder. "Yes," Ethan gasped, steadying it with all his strength. "Good, just a few steps." They staggered forward. 10 feet, rest. Another 20, rest again. What should have taken an hour stretched into the entire day. Ethan's back screamed, his breath tore at his throat. Snow fell steadily, blurring the world into gray and white. But he didn't stop, neither did the horse. They moved together, man and beast, dragging the travois inch by inch through drifts and over frozen ridges. By late afternoon, when the cabin finally came into sight through the trees, Ethan nearly collapsed from relief. The horse stumbled, nearly going down again, but Ethan hauled on the rope, shouting encouragement. "Almost there. Don't you dare quit now." One last surge, one last ragged pull, and then they reached the clearing around the cabin. Ethan guided the horse into the old tool shed, half rotten but still standing, and collapsed against the wall. His chest burned, his legs shook violently. The horse sank onto straw with a groan, but alive. Alive. Snow began to fall again outside, thick and silent. Ethan looked at the animal, ribs rising and falling, eyes half closed. He felt his own chest mirror that rhythm, as if their breaths had aligned. "Welcome home," he whispered. The next hours blurred. He hauled water from the pump, mixed grain mash from supplies meant for deer in winter, coaxed the horse to sip and chew. He cleaned the wound again, applied fresh bandages, whispered nonsense until his throat went raw. That night, he didn't return to his cabin. Instead, he dragged a cot into the tool shed and laid it beside the horse. The smell of blood and antiseptic clung to the air. The space heater hummed weakly, fighting against the cold. He lay awake, listening. Each breath the horse took felt like a victory. Each shift of muscle, a reminder that this wasn't over. Ethan closed his eyes, and, for the first time in years, the dreams weren't of war. They were of snow, of hooves breaking drifts, of dark eyes watching him through the night. When he woke before dawn, he found himself staring into that gaze again. The horse hadn't moved much, but its eyes were clearer, focused, a silent challenge. "Yeah," Ethan rasped, voice thick with sleep. "I'm still here too." Days bled into each other after that. Ethan rose at dawn, cleaned wounds, checked vitals, forced water, measured out mash. The horse fought through fevers, tremors, moments when its body sagged as if ready to surrender. Ethan refused to let it. He had nothing left in his life but this battle, and he poured himself into it without hesitation. The shed became their world. Outside, snow continued to fall, burying the trails, isolating them further. But inside, man and horse fought a war together, one for life, one for meaning. By the end of the first week, the wound had begun to knit. Infection still lingered, but the fever broke one morning, and Ethan nearly laughed from relief. He hadn't laughed in years. The sound startled him, rusty and strange. He brushed the horse's neck, fingers tangling in coarse mane. "Guess you're as stubborn as I am." The horse leaned faintly into the touch, accepting it. Ethan's chest tightened. Something inside him had shifted. He wasn't alone anymore. Late one night, as snow rattled against the shed roof, Ethan stirred awake. The horse was standing now massive, filling the small space, its head nearly brushing the beams. In the half-light of the lantern, its white coat gleamed like new snow. The animal turned, meeting his gaze directly. For the first time, it stepped forward, lowering its head until its muzzle pressed gently against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan froze, breath caught. He had spent months avoiding human touch, recoiling from every hand, every attempt to connect. Yet here, in the quiet of a drafty shed, a wild creature reached for him. Something cracked open in his chest. "You're not just surviving," Ethan whispered. "You're fighting with me." But in the silence that followed, another thought crept in, sharp, unsettling. If this horse wasn't lost, if it had come from somewhere, then who else might already be looking for it? The days lengthened into weeks, though Ethan barely noticed the calendar pinned crooked above his workbench. Life fell into a rhythm. Clean the wound, haul water, mix feed, brush the coarse white coat. The silence of his cabin had once felt suffocating, but now the sound of hooves shifting straw, the rumble of breath, even the faint swish of a tail carried a kind of solace he hadn't known he needed. The horse was changing before his eyes. The gaunt ribs that had pressed sharp against skin now softened beneath fresh muscle. The infection that had nearly stolen its life ebbed away, leaving a jagged scar puckered along the flank but no longer weeping blood. When Ethan opened the shed door each morning, he was met not with a collapsed heap of exhaustion, but with dark eyes that burned clear, steady. It was those eyes that unsettled him most. He had looked into the gaze of countless horses before working ranch stock, half-wild Mustangs, even skittish ponies when he was a boy, but nothing like this. Ghost's eyes didn't just watch, they studied, measured, reflected something back at him. One crisp morning, Ethan entered with a bucket of fresh water. He set it down, expecting the horse to drink. Instead, Ghost stepped forward, blocking the light. The animal lowered its head until its forehead pressed lightly against Ethan's chest. The gesture was deliberate, intimate in a way that made Ethan freeze. His instinct was to flinch, to recoil from touch, the way he always did with people. But this wasn't a hand, wasn't human pity or curiosity. This was different. Ethan's arms lifted almost against his will, resting awkwardly along the thick arch of the neck. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing in sync with the steady rise and fall of the great animal. His chest felt strangely lighter. "Guess we're in this together now," he muttered. That night, he couldn't sleep, not because of nightmares, those had been fewer lately, but because of what he had felt in that quiet moment. Connection. The next morning, he did something he hadn't in months. He saddled up his old pickup and drove 30 miles down to town. The feed store smelled of hay and molasses, warm against the bite of late winter air. The bell above the door jingled as Ethan stepped inside, pulling his cap low. He hadn't been here in nearly a year. "Morning," the owner grunted, sizing him up with curious eyes. "Haven't seen you around, Harrison." "Been keeping to myself," Ethan replied. He placed a list on the counter: antibiotics, salve, higher grade feed. The man squinted. "Sounds like you're doctoring something serious. What is it, a draft horse?" Ethan hesitated. He'd rehearsed an answer on the drive, but found his throat tightening. "Just helping an animal I found in bad shape." The owner scratched his beard. "Hope you know what you're doing. Draft crosses can be tricky, big ones especially. Worth a fortune, though, if you've got one of the rare whites. Breeders would pay through the nose." Ethan forced a smile, paid, and left quickly. He felt the weight of eyes on his back long after he'd driven away. Back at the cabin, Ghost greeted him with a sharp whinny, as if annoyed at his absence. Ethan set the supplies down, shaking his head. "You're trouble, you know that? If anyone finds out about you, they'll never leave us alone." He caught himself. Us. Not just the horse, not just him, them. Spring thaw came slowly to Montana, creeping down from the ridges in thin rivulets that cut through the snow. Ethan began letting Ghost into the paddock each day. At first, the animal limped, favoring the scarred flank, but within a week, he was moving with startling grace, circling the perimeter, nostrils flaring at every new scent. One morning, Ethan leaned on the fence as Ghost galloped across the meadow. For a creature so massive, he moved like wind itself, powerful and fluid, mane streaming like a banner of white fire. Ethan's chest tightened at the sight. For the first time in years, he felt something crack open inside him, wonder. When Ghost slowed and approached the fence, Ethan found himself smiling. "You need a name," he said aloud. "Can't just keep calling you horse." The animal snorted, ears twitching forward. "Ghost," Ethan decided. "That's what you are. Out of the snow, out of nowhere. A ghost that refused to die." Ghost bobbed his head once, as if in agreement. Ethan laughed, the sound rusty and unfamiliar, but peace never lasted long in Ethan's life. One afternoon, as he brushed Ghost's coat, he noticed something beneath the mane, a faint indentation on the skin just behind the ear. He parted the hair and froze. It was a mark, faded, scarred over, but unmistakably human-made, a brand. His hand trembled as he traced the edges. Someone had once owned this horse. Someone had claimed him. The implications churned through Ethan's mind. Ghost wasn't simply wild. He had a history, maybe even a pedigree. If the wrong people learned he was alive, they might come looking. That night, Ethan sat by the shed, lantern flickering against the wooden walls, and spoke aloud for the first time about Afghanistan. "I lost 3 men," he said, voice rough. "Thought I could live with it. Thought I deserved to carry it alone. But I can't. I can't keep burying it." Ghost shifted closer, lowering his head until the warm breath tickled Ethan's arm. The silence stretched, steady, forgiving. Ethan let the words spill memories he hadn't dared say aloud to another human. The ambush, the radio call that came too late, the guilt that gnawed him hollow. By the time dawn painted the sky pale, Ethan's eyes burned raw, but his chest felt lighter. Ghost had not judged, had not turned away, just listened. The following week brought the first test of that fragile peace. Ethan was stacking wood when the crunch of tires sounded from the road. A Forest Service truck rolled into view, green emblem bright against its white paint. 2 rangers stepped out. "Afternoon," the older one said. "We've had reports of a large white horse spotted in these parts. Unusual animal. Anyone around here seen something like that?" Ethan's heart pounded. He forced his expression still. "Just deer and elk. Haven't seen a horse." The ranger studied him, then nodded slowly. "Well, keep your eyes open. If you do spot something, let us know. Could be escaped livestock, could be something else." When the truck finally disappeared down the road, Ethan leaned against the cabin wall, breath shuddering out. Ghost grazed quietly in the paddock, oblivious or perhaps not. Those dark eyes lifted, fixing on him with a weight that made his chest ache. "They're already looking for you," Ethan whispered. "What the hell are you, Ghost?" That night, unable to sleep, Ethan dug out an old map of the county. He traced the ridgelines with a calloused finger, trying to imagine where Ghost might have come from. No ranch nearby had reported a missing animal. No brand registry matched the scar behind his ear. As lantern light flickered, Ethan realized something chilling. The mark wasn't any ranch symbol he recognized. It was sharper, cleaner, more like a code than a brand. Ghost shifted in the shadows, eyes glinting with an intelligence that felt almost human. Ethan swallowed hard. "Who put that on you?" he murmured. And for the first time, he wondered if saving Ghost hadn't pulled him into something far larger and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The nights grew shorter, yet Ethan found them no easier. Each time the lantern flickered low in the tool shed, his eyes drifted back to that scar on Ghost's neck. It wasn't the crude work of a rancher's brand, burned by iron into hide. No, this was deliberate, precise, as if etched by someone with a different purpose altogether. The edges were too clean, the lines too uniform. He couldn't shake the thought. What kind of horse carries a mark like that? Ghost, for his part, behaved with a calm steadiness that only deepened the mystery. The animal accepted food, leaned into brushing, even tolerated Ethan's clumsy attempts to clean the scar. And yet, every so often, when the night was quietest, Ethan swore Ghost was studying him, testing him, the way one soldier sizes up another before deciding whether to trust. One afternoon, Ethan saddled up Rusty, the old trail horse, who had seen better days, and rode the 6-mile path into town. He hadn't planned to speak much, but the silence of his cabin had grown heavy, filled with unanswered questions. At the county library, dust and fluorescent light greeted him. He hadn't set foot here since before Afghanistan, back when he still believed in college classes and small-town futures. Now, it felt foreign, almost hostile. The librarian eyed him with a mix of recognition and curiosity. "Mr. Harrison, been a while." "Yeah," Ethan kept his voice low, "looking for brand registries, ranch marks, state archives, anything on horses." The woman frowned but led him to a back shelf stacked with thick binders. "Everything filed through the Department of Livestock is in here. Some of it goes back 50 years. For 2 hours, Ethan combed through page after page, sketch after sketch. Circles, triangles, stylized letters, crude emblems scorched into hide across generations of ranch stock. None of them matched Ghost's mark, not even close. When he closed the last binder, the tightness in his chest worsened. If it wasn't ranch, then what? On his way out, he heard the librarian's voice. "Strange thing, isn't it? People been talking about a white horse up in the hills. Big one. Some say it's escaped from one of those breeding outfits near Billings." Ethan stiffened, muttered something non-committal, and pushed through the door. Outside, the air felt thinner. Word was spreading. Too fast. Back at the cabin, Ghost greeted him with that steady gaze. Ethan ran his hand along the horse's neck, fingers brushing the scar. "They're looking for you already," he murmured. "And I don't even know what you are." That night, the dreams returned, sandstorms and gunfire, voices screaming in a language he half understood. But this time, they twisted. When he turned in his dream, It wasn't soldiers falling beside him, it was Ghost, collapsing in dust, eyes burning with betrayal. He woke with a cry, drenched in sweat. Shoving open the shed door, Ethan stumbled into the straw. Ghost was standing, massive frame filling the small space, as if waiting. Ethan pressed his forehead against the horse's mane, shaking. "Not losing you too. Not again." A week later, the knock came. It was light, polite, but in the silence of his isolated cabin, it struck like a rifle shot. Ethan's instincts flared, every nerve screaming danger. On his porch stood a woman in her 50s, wiry and sharp-eyed, wearing field boots and carrying a leather satchel. "Mr. Harrison?" she asked, voice calm. "I'm Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, University of Montana. I'd like to ask you about a horse." Ethan's stomach nodded. "Don't know what you're talking about," he said flatly. Her eyes flicked toward the paddock where Ghost's pale coat glimmered against the spring grass. "Reports were accurate then," she murmured. Ethan stepped forward, blocking her view. "He's mine. Found him half dead in the forest. Been nursing him since." "I don't doubt that," Reeves said softly. She kept her distance, palms open, her tone more like a plea than a demand. "But that's no ordinary horse. His size, his coloring, and that scar behind his ear, that isn't a ranch brand." Ethan's jaw clenched. "So you've seen it too?" Reeves nodded. "I've studied equine genetics for 27 years. That mark, it's not livestock. It looks closer to a coded tag, the kind sometimes used in research programs." The words landed like stones. Research, programs. Ethan's throat went dry. "You're saying he's an experiment?" "I don't know," Reeves admitted, "but I do know others are interested. Government agencies, private labs, they don't always respect ownership. If they find out you've got him." Her gaze was steady, urgent. "You need to decide whether you want to protect him or let them take him apart piece by piece to learn what makes him different." Ethan felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Ghost shifted in the paddock, raising his head, ears pricked toward them as though listening. "I won't let that happen," Ethan said, voice low, final. Reeves studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then you'd better prepare, because they will come." For the rest of the day, Ethan couldn't focus. Every sound from the trees made him tense. Every passing cloud shadow felt like an eye overhead. He found himself pacing the perimeter of the property, reinforcing the paddock gate, checking his rifle more than once. Ghost followed him along the fence line, dark eyes calm in contrast to Ethan's rising dread. At dusk, Ethan stood leaning against the wood, the horse's muzzle brushing his shoulder. "What the hell have I brought into my life?" he whispered. The only answer was the steady rhythm of Ghost's breath, warm against his neck. That night, unable to rest, Ethan lit the lantern and opened Dr. Reeves's card she had left behind. One line stood out beneath her name and number. "If he starts showing behaviors you can't explain, call me immediately." Ethan set the card down, unsettled. Behaviors he couldn't explain? He turned toward the paddock just in time to see Ghost do something impossible. The horse had pressed its muzzle against the latch. With slow, deliberate precision, it lifted the bar free, swung the gate wide, and stepped back inside, locking it behind him with a nudge of his head. Ethan froze, breath caught. "That wasn't instinct," he murmured. "That was thought." And for the first time, a terrifying question lodged in his mind. What if Ghost isn't just a horse at all? Ethan lay awake long after the lantern had burned out. The image of Ghost working the latch burned into his mind like a brand. Horses nudged gates open all the time. He'd seen ranch stock push with their noses or lean against weak latches. But this had been different. Too precise, too deliberate. He replayed it over and over. The muzzle sliding the bar, the calculated pause, the gate swung wide, then shut again. It wasn't instinct. It was decision. By dawn, Ethan's eyes were gritty, his nerves frayed. He rose, dressed, and stepped outside into the cold air. Frost glittered across the paddock fence, and there was Ghost standing tall, white coat glowing in the early light. When the horse spotted him, it walked forward, slow and steady, as though aware of the questions that weighed on him. Ethan braced his forearms against the wood rails. "What are you, Ghost? Just some freak accident of breeding, or something else?" Ghost held his gaze. No blink, no shift. The silence pressed in until Ethan swore the answer hovered just out of reach, like a word he couldn't recall. By mid-morning, the sound of tires on gravel cut through the forest quiet. Ethan tensed, hand instinctively going to the rifle propped beside the porch. Dr. Reeves's silver sedan rolled to a stop. She stepped out, her satchel slung across her shoulder, her breath steaming in the cool air. "I needed to see him again," she said, skipping any pretense of greeting. "I couldn't get that scar out of my head." Ethan hesitated, then nodded stiffly. He led her toward the paddock. Ghost was grazing, but when the woman approached, the horse lifted his head and walked straight toward her, nostrils flaring. Reeves drew in a sharp breath. Magnificent. She watched him move, her eyes narrowing. You've noticed, haven't you? The way he problem solves, the way he watches. Ethan's jaw tightened. He opened the gate last night, worked the latch, then shut it behind him. Reeves turned sharply, eyes wide. Deliberately? Yes, deliberately. She scribbled notes into her leather journal, muttering under her breath. If that's true, cognitive mapping beyond any equine baseline. It's not just intelligence, it's pattern recognition. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. Tell me straight, Doc. What did they do to him? Reeves shut her notebook. For once, her clinical tone softened. I don't know, but that scar, it doesn't match livestock branding. It looks closer to a research tag. I've seen similar in projects involving behavioral genetics, government contracts, military applications. The words hit Ethan like a cold wind. Military, applications. He'd left one war behind only to stumble into another. I won't let anyone take him, Ethan said, voice rough. Reeves studied him, then gave a short nod. Then you'll need to be ready, because if I can connect these dots, so can others. And they won't knock politely. For the next week, paranoia dug its claws deeper into Ethan's mind. He reinforced the shed, added new locks, even started digging a shallow trench around the paddock line like some half-mad survivalist. At night, he patrolled the perimeter with a flashlight, Ghost's pale form always visible at the fence line, calm against his storm. And Ghost only grew stranger. One morning, Ethan hid an apple inside an old toolbox, snapping the lid shut. He left it in the paddock and watched from the fence. Ghost approached, sniffed, then paused. With deliberate care, the horse hooked the latch with his teeth, flipped it, and nosed the lid open. The apple vanished in 2 bites. Ethan's heart hammered. He'd expected pawing, maybe frustrated nudging. Not this. Later that evening, Ghost found the spot where Ethan had left a coil of rope. When Ethan returned, he found the horse had dragged it across the paddock and looped it over the fence post, the ends hanging in a crude knot. Not tied, but close enough to send chills down his spine. Christ, Ethan whispered, you're trying to show me. The breakthrough came one restless night. Ethan was sitting in the shed, sharpening his knife just for something to do, when Ghost shifted close. The horse lowered his head until their eyes were level. Ethan froze. Then Ghost did something he hadn't expected. The animal stamped once, deliberately, then tossed his head toward the forest. Ethan frowned. What? You want me to follow? Ghost stamped again, harder this time. Against his better judgment, Ethan grabbed a lantern and unlatched the paddock. Ghost strode ahead, massive frame glowing ghost-like in the dark. Ethan followed, heart pounding, until they reached the tree line. There, in the mud softened by thaw, were tracks. Tire tracks. Fresh. 2 sets, wide, heavy, cutting across the road and veering toward the ridge. Ethan crouched, lantern trembling in his hand. Someone had been up here, watching. He turned slowly toward Ghost. The horse stood still, ears pricked, eyes steady on him, almost as if to say, I knew. The next morning, Reeves returned, unannounced. Worry etched into her face. Ethan showed her the tire tracks. She went pale. They've found him, she whispered. Who? Ethan demanded. I don't know which branch, Reeves admitted, but if those tracks belong to who I think, you need to move him. Soon. Ethan's throat tightened. The thought of Ghost anywhere but here twisted his gut. But the thought of strangers in sterile labs was worse. Where? He asked. Reeves hesitated. There are valleys north of here, high, remote. If you can get him there, it might buy time. Ethan looked toward the paddock. Ghost was watching again, head high, mane lifting in the breeze. The decision settled heavy in his chest. If war was coming to his doorstep, he wouldn't wait for it. He'd take the fight to the wilderness instead. That night, as the storm winds howled through the pines, Ethan sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap. The cabin windows glowed faintly behind him, Ghost shifting restlessly in the paddock. From the dark woods came a sound, a twig snapping, deliberate. Then another, too heavy for deer, too measured for elk. Ethan froze, finger sliding against the trigger. Through the trees, a faint glint of light caught his eye. The reflection of glass, binoculars. Someone was watching. He rose slowly, heart thundering, and whispered into the night. They've already found us. The night pressed in around the cabin like a living thing, heavy with pine and snowmelt. Ethan stood frozen on the porch, rifle snug in his shoulder, eyes locked on the faint glint of binoculars disappearing into the tree line. His breath came shallow, steady. Whoever was out there knew how to move quietly, Not hunters, not hikers, watchers. A twig snapped again, this time farther left. 2 of them, maybe more. Ethan stepped back, heart hammering. Ghost shifted in the paddock, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. The great white horse let out a low rumble, almost a warning. "Yeah," Ethan muttered. "I know." He slipped inside, doused the lantern, and pressed his back against the wall. Darkness swallowed the cabin. He waited, listening. The silence outside was broken only by the wind threading through the pines. After an eternity, boots crunched faintly in the snow. Then, silence. Whoever it was, they weren't careless. That chilled him more than anything. By dawn, the intruders were gone, or hiding well. Ethan found tracks circling just beyond the clearing, never crossing into open ground. Careful, intentional. He crouched, brushing a finger through the print of a military-style boot. Fresh. Ghost stood near the fence, watching. When Ethan approached, the horse nudged his shoulder firmly, almost knocking him off balance. "You felt them, didn't you?" Ethan whispered. The horse's steady gaze answered more than words could. That afternoon, Dr. Reeves arrived. Her face drained when she saw the tracks. "They've moved faster than I thought," she said, kneeling to inspect the impressions. "Not Forest Service. These are tactical." "Private contractors?" Ethan asked. "Or worse," she replied grimly. "Some of the labs outsource their retrieval. They don't want paperwork, just results." Ethan's fists clenched. "He's not a result. He's alive." Reeves looked at him sharply. "That's why they'll stop at nothing to take him. Ethan, if they file the right orders, they can classify him as government property. They'll come with law on their side." Ethan's throat tightened. He'd fought enemies in deserts half a world away, but this felt worse. At least in combat, you knew which way the bullets were flying. Here, the danger crept in through silence and paperwork. "So what do I do?" he asked finally. Reeves straightened, her jaw set. "You get ahead of them. Move him. Tonight if you can." That evening, Ethan gathered supplies: grain, water flasks, a bedroll. His hands moved with military precision, the way they had in another life. Ghost watched from the paddock, pacing the fence as though sensing the urgency. When Ethan approached with the halter, Ghost stilled, lowering his head. No fight, no resistance, as if agreeing. "Good boy," Ethan murmured. "We don't have long." They slipped into the trees as dusk bled across the sky. Ethan kept his steps silent, rifle strapped across his back, pack digging into his shoulders. Ghost moved beside him, massive yet unnervingly quiet, hooves placing each step with uncanny care. For hours, they climbed into the higher ridges, avoiding open ground, weaving through dense timber. Ethan's senses stayed sharp, every gust of wind, every owl's cry, testing his nerves. At one point, Ghost halted suddenly, ears swiveling. Ethan froze. Ahead, faint voices carried through the trees. Male, 2, maybe 3. He eased Ghost behind a granite outcrop and crouched low. Flashlights flickered between the pines. Words drifted closer. "Tracks are fresh. He's moving him." Ethan's stomach dropped. They were on the trail. The men passed within 30 yards, rifles slung, movements disciplined. Not weekend hunters, professionals. Ethan kept his breath shallow until the last light vanished. Then he pressed his forehead briefly against Ghost's neck. "They're closing in. We need to go higher." By midnight, the pair reached a narrow shelf overlooking the valley. Ethan sank against a boulder, lungs burning, legs trembling. Ghost stood beside him, steam rising from his body, but his dark eyes remained sharp, unyielding. Ethan stared into the night, exhaustion clawing at him. "I can't outrun them forever." Ghost turned, pressed his muzzle into Ethan's shoulder again, steady, grounding. It calmed him in a way no pill, no therapy had ever managed. "You keep pulling me back, don't you?" Ethan whispered. The horse snorted softly, almost like an answer. Just before dawn, snow began to fall again, thin, sharp flakes that cut across the ridges. Ethan stirred awake at the sound of movement. Ghost was alert, ears forward, body tense. Then he heard it too. A drone. High-pitched, mechanical, sweeping the valley. Ethan's blood ran cold. They weren't just tracking him on the ground anymore. He pulled the tarp tighter over Ghost's back, praying the white coat would blend into the snow. Above, a faint red light scanned the tree line, searching. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, mercifully, the buzzing faded into the distance. Ethan exhaled shakily. They're not going to stop. By mid-morning, they descended into a sheltered hollow, thick with spruce. Ethan built a small fire beneath a rock overhang, careful to shield the smoke. He chewed jerky absently, eyes never leaving Ghost. "I don't know how far this goes," he admitted aloud, "but if they branded you, experimented on you, then you're more than just a horse, and that means they'll never stop hunting you." Ghost lowered his head, resting it against Ethan's shoulder with deliberate weight. Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment, the war, the chases, the shadows, everything fell away. Just a man and a horse in the wilderness, both refusing to surrender. But peace was always brief. That night, as the storm thickened, Ethan woke to Ghost's restless movements. The horse circled the hollow, ears flicking, muscles taut. Then Ethan heard it low voices moving through the trees, closer than before. A flashlight beam sliced through the snow, sweeping across the rock wall. Ethan's hand tightened on his rifle. His pulse thundered in his ears. "They've found us," he whispered. And then, cutting through the night, came a sharp command from the darkness. "Don't move, Harrison. Step away from the animal." Snow whipped sideways, carried by wind that screamed through the trees. Ethan crouched low, rifle raised, the fire inside the hollow already stamped out. His pulse hammered in his ears as the command echoed again through the storm. "Step away from the animal, Harrison. Hands where I can see them." The voice was amplified by authority, calm, deliberate, practiced. Not the wild slur of drunken hunters, not the bark of a rookie. This was military. Ghost shifted beside him, massive body blocking part of the light that swept the hollow. The horse's muscles trembled, but his ears pricked forward, alert. Ethan whispered, almost to himself, "Not tonight." He slid his hand along Ghost's neck, then eased sideways into the shadows. A beam of light slashed across the hollow. "Last warning, Harrison." Ethan fired. Not at the men, not yet, but at the ground between them. Snow and dirt exploded upward, scattering the light. Shouts erupted. "Contact left. He's armed." Ethan grabbed Ghost's halter and lunged into the storm. Bullets cracked through the trees, sharp and close. Ghost surged forward, his weight nearly ripping the rope from Ethan's hands, but he held on, weaving them both between boulders and fallen logs. They ran blind through the snow, Ghost's hooves pounding like war drums. Ethan's breath tore in his throat, lungs screaming. Behind them, voices barked orders, but the storm muffled direction. He skidded into a ravine, pulling Ghost down the slope with him. The horse stumbled once, then found footing, moving with surprising agility for his size. They crouched beneath the shelter of overhanging rock. Ethan pressed his back against stone, rifle up, chest heaving. Above, boots pounded past. Flashlights darted. For one tense moment, a beam hovered inches from their hiding spot. Ethan held his breath, every muscle screaming. Then the light moved on. Ghost exhaled a hot plume into the freezing air. Ethan closed his eyes. "We're not out yet." By dawn, they had circled back miles away, snow covering their tracks. Ethan's body ached from exhaustion, but adrenaline kept him moving. Ghost never faltered, never lagged, as if the storm fed him strength instead of sapping it. They reached a ridge overlooking the valley. Below, Ethan spotted something that froze him cold. Black SUVs crawling the dirt road like beetles. Men spilled out, forming a grid, sweeping upward. Organized, professional, they're tightening the net, Ethan muttered. Ghost pressed close, his muzzle brushing Ethan's shoulder. The gesture steadied him more than words ever could. That afternoon, as Ethan scouted a new route north, he stumbled on fresh tracks, 2 sets of boots, lighter than the rest. Not soldiers, different stride. He followed cautiously, Ghost trailing. The trail led to a small clearing where a figure crouched beside a stream, refilling a canteen. When she looked up, Ethan nearly lowered his rifle in shock. Dr. Reeves. Her eyes widened. "Ethan, thank God. I tried to reach your cabin, but—" She gestured at the woods. "They're everywhere," Ethan hissed, pulling her into cover. "You shouldn't be here." "I had to," she insisted. "They've escalated. Whoever's funding this private, federal, I don't know, they've declared Ghost a biological asset. That gives them authority to seize him under emergency orders." Ethan's gut twisted. "They'll have to kill me first." Reeves met his gaze, unflinching. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." The 3 of them, man, woman, horse, moved together under cover of dusk. Reeves was no soldier, but she kept up, quiet and careful. Ghost stayed close, his pale coat blending eerily into the snowstorm like a phantom. By nightfall, they reached a narrow gorge, walls steep and slick with ice. Ethan judged it defensible, at least for a while. He set Reeves behind a boulder, rifle steady in his hands. When the voices came again closer, this time his nerves steadied into the old soldier's focus. He'd been here before. Ambushes, traps, the razor's edge between survival and death. The first shadow appeared through the snow. Ethan didn't hesitate. A warning shot cracked, echoing off the gorge walls. The figure dove for cover. Shouts erupted. "Target located. Secure the horse." Ghost reared, a thunderous cry ripping from his chest. The sound vibrated through stone and snow alike, wild and furious. For a heartbeat, the advancing men faltered, shaken by the sheer primal force of it. Ethan seized the opening. He fired again, controlled bursts, driving them back. Snow exploded where bullets struck, shards stinging his face. One man tried to flank. Ghost lunged sideways, massive body slamming the intruder against the rock wall. The soldier dropped his weapon, scrambling away, eyes wide with terror. Ethan's chest clenched. The horse wasn't just intelligent, he was fighting with him. The firefight raged until the storm thickened, swallowing visibility. The attackers pulled back, regrouping. Their voices faded into static on radios. Ethan crouched beside Reeves, chest heaving, rifle hot in his hands. She stared at Ghost with wide, awed eyes. "He's not just surviving," she whispered. "He's choosing." Ethan swallowed hard, watching the horse's silhouette against the storm. Ghost stood tall, ears forward, like a sentinel. "He's choosing us," Ethan said. When the storm finally broke, silence blanketed the gorge. Ethan dared to hope they'd bought time. He checked Reeves, shaken but unhurt. Ghost grazed quietly, steam rising from his body. Then Ethan noticed it. On the snow where one of the intruders had fallen, a black pouch lay half buried. He picked it up, unzipped it, and froze. Inside was a file, marked with a red stamp. Project Aurora. Classified. Reeves inhaled sharply. "Aurora, I've heard whispers. If this is real..." Ethan flipped the folder open. Diagrams, notes, genetic codes, and a photo ghost, younger, penned in a sterile white facility. His stomach dropped. "They've had him before," he whispered, "and they'll do anything to take him back." From the woods beyond the gorge, a flare shot into the sky, red, glowing, a signal. Reeves's face drained of color. "They're calling in reinforcements." Ethan gripped the file tighter, his voice low and certain. Then, the real fight hasn't even started. The flare burned crimson above the ridge, staining the storm clouds like blood. Ethan's gut tightened as he watched it fade. Reinforcements. They weren't pulling back. They were calling in more. Beside him, Dr. Reeves flipped frantically through the folder they'd recovered. Her hands shook as she skimmed pages of diagrams, genetic strings, stamped reports. "It's worse than I thought," she whispered. Aurora wasn't about breeding. It was about rewriting. Behavioral enhancement, accelerated cognition. They were trying to engineer an animal that could partner with soldiers on the battlefield, not just obey, but anticipate. Her eyes lifted, wide with awe and fear. "That's what Ghost is. He's proof it worked." Ethan's chest constricted. He stared at Ghost, who stood calm and unflinching despite the storm, dark eyes steady on him. "You're telling me he's a weapon," Ethan said. "I'm telling you they think he is," Reeves corrected softly. "But what I see is choice. He isn't bound to commands. He's bound to you." Ethan ran a hand across his face. His whole life, he'd been haunted by the choices of war, when to fight, when to pull the trigger, when to call artillery on a village that had never been the enemy. And now fate had dropped another choice in his lap. Fight to keep Ghost, or set him free before the world consumed him. The sound of engines shattered the silence. Ethan jerked his head up. Through the falling snow, headlights carved up the valley. Black SUVs, larger convoy this time. Radios crackled faintly across the gorge. "They'll box us in," Reeves hissed. "Not if we move first," Ethan muttered. They broke camp swiftly. Reeves stuffed the file back into her satchel. Ethan looped the rope around Ghost's halter, though the horse didn't need guidance. He moved at Ethan's side willingly, like a comrade falling into step. They scaled the ridge under cover of storm. Below, beams of flashlights swept the gorge, voices barking orders, boots crunching snow. Halfway up, a spotlight pierced the clouds, cutting across the slope. "Helicopter." Ethan cursed under his breath. "They're escalating fast," Reeves gasped. Ghost snorted, stamping against the snow. His eyes flashed in the white glare, defiant. Ethan pressed his forehead to the horse's mane. "Not much longer, partner. Just hold with me." By dawn, they reached Blodgett Pass, a jagged cut between cliffs, leading into a valley untouched by roads or maps. The place Reeves had whispered of. Ethan had been here once in his youth, chasing elk with his father. Remote, hidden, a sanctuary carved by glaciers. The sight of it hit him like a prayer answered. "We make it through here," Ethan said, voice hoarse, "and maybe we've got a chance." But as they started down, the crack of gunfire rang across the ridge. Bullets hissed into the snow near their feet. "Contact," voices shouted. Ethan spun, rifle up, returning fire in sharp bursts. Reeves ducked behind rock. Ghost reared, a furious bellow tearing from his chest that echoed like thunder. The sound startled the advancing line long enough for Ethan to drag Reeves lower into the pass. But they were pinned. Snow sprayed as more bullets struck stone. Shouts closed in from both flanks. The net was tightening. Ethan's mind raced. No exit but down into the valley, and once there, no way out again. A sanctuary, yes, but also a prison. He looked at Ghost. The horse pawed the ground, muscles coiled, breath steaming. His dark eyes locked with Ethan's, steady, unyielding. And Ethan understood. This wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about release. He yanked the rope free, pulling the halter loose. The leather strap fell away into the snow. Reeves's eyes widened. "Ethan, what are you doing?" "What I should have done from the start," he said. His voice cracked but held firm. "I'm not keeping him. I'm keeping my word." Ghost lowered his head, pressing his muzzle to Ethan's chest one last time. The weight of it crushed him and healed him all at once. "Go," Ethan whispered, "before they cage you again." For a heartbeat, Ghost didn't move. Then, with a surge like lightning, he wheeled and thundered down into the valley, white against white, mane streaming like a banner. Shouts erupted behind them. "He's loose! Cut him off!" But the storm swallowed him. Gunfire intensified. Ethan turned, rifle blazing, holding the line at the ridge. Reeves screamed for him to move, but he stood his ground, giving Ghost every second. Bullets shattered rock, ricocheted past his head. His body jolted with old instincts: fight, shield, endure. When the magazines clicked empty on both sides, silence fell heavy. Through the haze of smoke and snow, the soldiers regrouped. But the horse was gone. One officer cursed into his radio. "Asset has escaped. Repeat, asset has..." Ethan fired his last round, shattering the radio into pieces. "I told you," he rasped. "He's not your asset." Hours later, the storm cleared. The men retreated, frustrated, leaving only tracks and shell casings behind. Reeves sat slumped against a boulder, clutching the satchel like a lifeline. Ethan stood silent, staring down into the valley. Far below, just for a moment, he thought he saw a white figure moving along the tree line. Strong, free, untouchable. His chest broke open with something between grief and relief. "You did it," Reeves murmured beside him. "You let him go." Ethan shook his head slowly. "No, he let me go." Weeks passed. The agencies never stopped sniffing around, but with no proof, no captured asset, their case thinned. Ethan returned to his cabin, battered but alive. Sometimes, at night, he swore he heard hooves in the distance. The old shed still smelled faintly of straw and antiseptic. Life moved on. He split wood, cooked simple meals, answered Reeves's occasional letters. Yet, the silence of the forest no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a covenant. One spring morning, Ethan hiked alone up to a ridge overlooking Blodgett Valley. Wildflowers spilled across the thawing ground. He stood there a long time, breathing air sharp with pine. Then, he saw it. Far below, in the meadow, a herd of wild horses grazed. Among them moved a giant white stallion, scar faint but visible on his neck. Ghost. Ethan's breath caught. Relief surged until he noticed something else. Two foals, barely steady on their legs, trotted at Ghost's side, white like him. And in that instant, Ethan understood. The story wasn't ending. It was multiplying. Wind swept the ridge, carrying a chill through his bones. If Ghost had passed his blood on, then Project Aurora wasn't dead. It was alive, running free in the mountains. Ethan closed his eyes, heart pounding with equal parts wonder and dread. Somewhere behind him, a branch snapped. The sound of footsteps deliberate, human approaching. He turned slowly, rifle not in his hands this time, but the old soldier's fire back in his eyes. "Who's there?" he demanded into the silence. The forest answered only with wind. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure if the real danger was over, or if it had only just begun.